whole day. All right. So last week we talked about child care subsidy. Let's have a review first. All right, before subsidy, the price for child care could be relatively higher. Now after subsidy, we have a new budget line here. So you see there is a rotation on the budget line. So the budget line becomes flatter, which means P1. This is Q2, Q1. So Q1 becomes cheaper, which means the government subsidizes the consumer and per unit by the amount of S. So S is per unit subsidy. And then new choice would be here, right? So let's make it E0 and E1. So the very first question is how much on earth the government subsidizes the consumer. So S is per unit, and then the next question should be how many units of child care the government subsidizes. It depends on how many units the consumer have or choose to consume. And actually this Q1 prime initially is Q1, and if we see after subsidy, after subsidy, the consumer increases the consumption on child care. So there are two effects here. From E0 to E1 is the price effect, right? And the pure substitution effect should be negative, which means when the price becomes cheaper, then we consume more. And in this case, you will see if the income effect is also negative, which means what should I say? I should say, all right, if child care is no more good, and now the real income should be increased, right? So the consumption is also is even more, because if it is a normal good, or if it is a inferior good but not that inferior. So once child care is not given good, then the price falls. The after policy consumption must be increased. And which one do you think, Q1 or Q1 prime? is the base on which the government subsidizes. If you are the government, you promise the consumer that, okay, I will give you some subsidy, and per unit it will be S. So it depends on how many units you consume. So if you are the government and you have made this promise, so which quantity, Q1 or Q1 prime, is the base on which you should subsidize? So after the announcement of the policy, and the consumer choose this level to consume, right? So this is the amount as a base on which you should subsidize, right? So you should subsidize Q1 prime times per unit subsidy. So it's the total subsidy. Make it the total subsidy. And since S, if we call it P prime, S is actually P1 minus P1 prime, Q1 prime, and which would be P1 Q1 prime minus P1 prime Q1 prime. Is that right? Yeah. So, what do you think? On the diagram, which part do you think we would say is P1 Q1 prime? Q1 prime, this amount, and if we just make an assumption, P2 equals 1, so the slope should be P1 over P2, right? Or over 1. So the slope would be P1, and the slope times the quantity would be this part, right? So this part would be P1 Q1 prime. Is that okay? And what about P1 prime Q1 prime? Now this is P1 prime, and P1 prime Q1 prime should be this part. Is that right? So the difference between these two numbers, should be this. Is that right? All right. So now, if we change the perspective, reducing price of check hair rotates budget line out, and so if we just provide another choice or another option, that lump sum payment instead of the subsidy. So if we just give the consumer a lump sum payment, and the amount of this lump sum payment equals to the taxpayer's cost of the subsidy. So now the taxpayer's cost, or the cost that the government spend, would be this amount, right? So if we do not change the price, we just give a lump sum payment. So if we do not change the price, the slope would stay as the initial one, right? And we shift since it's a payment, it's a positive payment, so the budget line should shift outward, right? Or shift upward. So the amount should look like this. So after the payment, the budget line becomes this one. And the difference between the two parallel budget lines should be this amount, right? And this amount corresponds to the total cost of the subsidy. Okay? So no matter you just subsidize the price of childcare, or you just give this consumer these payments, the government spend the same amount of money, right? The total cost to all taxpayers should be the same. Now we are comparing two policies, subsidy and oops. All right, now we have two different policies or two options. One is subsidy, which changes the price of childcare, makes childcare cheaper, right? And the other would be lump sum payment. So a lump sum payment doesn't change any price, but it's just a transfer from the government to the consumer, right? So policy one, subsidy, is to change or to rotate the budget line outward. And policy number two, the lump sum payment, will shift the budget line parallelly outward. And this would be the cost to the taxpayer to do these two policies, right? So if we want to compare these two policies, we should compare them with a reasonable, comparable standard, right? And the standard would be this: the taxpayer's cost of the subsidy. So both policies are with the same cost. So which means the government just spent the same amount of money. And we would like to know which policy or which policy is better or preferred by the consumers. Okay? So any kind of comparison should be based on the same standard. And now this is the common base for them to compare the cost of the policy. If you are the consumer, which one do you prefer? Subsidy or lump sum payment? If you choose subsidy, the yellow indifference curve would be the highest level of utility you may reach, okay? You may achieve. However, if you choose policy number 2, lump sum payment, your choice can be here with an even higher indifference curve, right? Is that clear? So we would say it's better for the consumer if we just give them cash transfer. So the logic would be the same. If you give the consumer do you remember we also mentioned last week in-kind transfer? A food stamp, right? In-kind transfer. So cash is always better than in-kind transfer or subsidy. However, it depends on other considerations. So you have besides the welfare, sometimes you have to check some other factors into account. So do you remember? Let's have a look at this. Alright. So actually food stamps can be used on food only. So consumers are potentially worse off if they would find it optimal to consume less food and more other goods than allowed by the program. However, we have some reasons why we adopt food stamps as a good policy rather than just cash transfer, right? Because the parents who received the food stamps or who received cash transfer, maybe they wanna have some more alcohol, some more drug, which is not we expect them to do. We hope to help those poor families with some kind of help that can make their children better, like education, like nutrition, right? So those things may be more important than, because sometimes the consumer, although they will feel better off, but their choices may not just meet our expectation, right? We don't want they take that much alcohol or that much drug. And subsidy is another example. So to make some policy comparison. Again, cash transfer would be better than you change the price. Because once you change the price, you distort the incentive of consumers to choose, right? You change the relative prices so that the consumer will feel, oh, childcare is more cheaper. But nowadays, most governments choose this kind of policy because it's more direct. And also, as you see, if the government just pay some cash to the consumer, their consumption, the level of consumption of childcare may be less than subsidy, right? So if your target is to increase the amount of childcare services, then subsidy may be good. But if you regard this problem from another perspective, from another viewpoint, like the well-being of the consumer, then cash transfer, the lump sum, the second one, lump sum payment, could be better. So in this case, the consumer may choose less childcare, but more Q2. Alright? They may want to pay some more money on other goods. They want to consume other goods more. So it depends on your policy target, your purpose. Alright, so far, any question here? Analyzing this problem, you have to think step by step. The first one would be the effect of a subsidy policy. It rotates the budget line, and the price effect will change from E0 to E1, and the consumption on childcare would increase from Q1 to Q1 prime. And next step is to compare these two policies. So we need to base on the same consideration. To compare policies, one thing or one intuitive thing is to ask whether or which policy costs you more. Okay? So cost is something very important because we always use benefit or cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis or benefit-cost analysis. Anything, we just measure the cost, measure the benefits, and to see which policy provides us a higher net benefit, which means a net benefit. The benefit minus cost. So we may control or we may hold the cost of these two policies the same, so that we may directly compare the benefit to the consumer. So this would be the benefit for the consumer, and the red indifference curve would be the benefit of policy number 2 to consumer, right? Policy number 1, subsidy, lump sum payment. So we hold the cost the same to make the comparison. Is that clear? Yes? Yeah, as I said, it's a cash transfer. I just give you money. So this kind of policy doesn't change the price, right? Doesn't change price at all. It's a relative shift. Any other question? Yes?
Where can we see the lump sum payments cost?
Hmm?
Lump sum payments cost
You mean we?
under the graph. Because
this part. The same. This would be the total subsidy, right? If you adopt the first policy, this part would be the cost. And now we parallel shift this budget line up by this amount. So the cost would be the same. Any other question? Yes.
可以再请你讲一次，就是为什么那个 rotate 它的subsidy 它的 cost 是那个区段？
Okay, this is the per unit subsidy, right? And this would be the amount the government have to pay according to this one, right? So after the policy, the consumer choose this amount to consume. And so Q1 prime times S equals, because S is actually P1 minus P1 prime, P1 minus P1 prime times Q1 prime. So it will be, it can be divided into two terms, okay? So P1, Q1 prime, this is P1, the slope P1, times Q1 prime would be this amount, right? P1, Q1 prime. And this amount would be P1 prime, Q1 prime.
所以是要对到那个点去，这个点对下来，所以要一条线。
Yeah, because the slope would be delta y over delta x, right? So the slope equals delta y over delta x, and the slope times delta x equals delta y. So Q1 prime P1 would be this amount, right? Or you may divide this amount by this. So it results into P1. Okay? For convenience, we made a assumption that P2 equals 1. And of course, you may skip this assumption. The result will be the same. Without this assumption, the story still goes on. No problem at all. Just make you a little bit trouble. Yes? MRT. MRT. What's the MRT for this? It's P1 over P2, right? And now P2 equals 1. So it's P1. And this would be P1 prime over P2. Alright? But without this assumption, you just make this as P2 and P2. And this would be this amount by P2. Okay? And you transfer this amount just like this amount of Q2, and the amount of money would be Q2 times P2, so the result would be the same.
Could you please tell us again about the target of the policy, since that it will reach a kind of different results? And I wanna know that what's the difference between the target of the policy between lump sum payment and also the subsidy?
Well, I just want to help the family. All right. So the subsidy is that, okay,